This is the third and final part of a video series called Writing About Literature, MLA Standards and Best Practices for Quoting and Documenting Sources. This particular video is going to look at some of the challenges and problems of citing literary texts. I just felt like starting with an image from Frankenstein. Frankenstein will be one of the examples that I use in this presentation. So different genres of literature create different challenges. We're going to start by talking about quoting poetry. So when quoting poetry, you almost always cite by line number rather than page number. If it is unclear that you're quoting from a poem, this is really an issue of audience awareness. But if it's an unfamiliar poem, a poem that your audience is likely not to know, then it's okay to include the word lines in your parenthetical citation the first time you cite the work. And then afterwards, you don't need to keep repeating lines over and over again. But most of the time, if it's a well-known poem, certainly if it's a poem that you've been assigned to read, or if it's a work by a well-known writer, you don't need to put lines in your parenthetical citation. Lines in good editions of poetry are usually supplied for you out in the margin if it's a long poem, usually by every 5. So you see in this example here, lines 1020 through 1030, and numbers have been put out there in the margin to tell you that, and those numbers are not part of the poem, obviously. Maybe if it was a Cummings poem. So in the example here, using integrated quotes, notice how inside the parenthetical citation, multiple line numbers are separated by a comma. That first example, separated by a comma. So I've got nothing like the sun, and Reeks is a Shakespeare sonnet 130 I'm quoting here. And because those quotes are not together, they're actually integrated, they're separate, my parenthetical citation refers to line 1, comma, and line 8. And then I use a forward slash. You see that in the second quote farther down there. The forward slash indicates line breaks. If you have a stanza break, then you do 2 forward slashes with no spaces between them. When quoting multiple lines, make sure in your parenthetical citation, make sure to retain the poet's original capitalization. For example, a lot of Renaissance poetry, Shakespeare sonnets, the first word of every line is capitalized, and you want to retain that capitalization. If you quote 4 or more consecutive lines of poetry, they should be formatted as a hanging quotation. Again, with prose, it's a little different. It's more than 4 lines. If it's poetry, it's 4 lines or more. And that rule can be a little confusing. So there are the line numbers separated by a comma. There's the forward slash that indicates a line break in the original source. And then I use an end dash. I guess a hyphen would work too, but technically you should use an end dash to indicate a range of lines, paragraphs, or pages. So that means lines 13 through 14. Also notice the ellipsis in there. Because poetry and verse drama are so highly structured, the ellipsis is used more frequently than when quoting prose. It is important to make the reader aware if a quote begins in the middle of a line of verse, or if a line continues beyond the end of the quote, or if lines have been completely omitted. I'll give you examples of all these. Here's the quote that I just showed you a moment ago. That is not the entire line, so I'm letting the reader know that by starting the quote with an ellipsis. You would not do this if you were quoting just one line. So if you look at the quotes, for example, above, that come from lines 1 and 8, I do not use ellipses there because each is taken from a single line. In this example, this is from Hamlet. The ellipsis here indicates that the writer removed the end of the line, and the reason that was done was to maintain grammatical coherence throughout the rest of the quote, because then the writer cut several lines completely and skipped down. So looks like 3, 4, 5, 6 lines here, but the whole passage comes from lines 61 to 73, which means that about 7 or 8 lines have been cut from the middle of the passage. And when entire lines have been removed, and really this, you should only really do this when you're quoting multiple lines of verse, like hanging quotes, 4 or more. You insert periods separated by spaces that extend for roughly the length of a line in the passage quoted. So 30 periods is about the same length as a line of pentameter verse. Whatever number you decide, just the important thing is to be consistent. So once I've created a line of dots that's that length, and if I omit more lines later, then I better make sure that I use the same number of dots. Quoting narrative and dramatic verse. So narrative poetry, for example, like the Iliad or the Odyssey of Homer, and then dramatic verse, pretty much anything written in the Renaissance, Shakespeare's Hamlet, for example. A lot of plays and narrative poems include divisions, acts, scenes, books, as well as line numbers. And these will need to be included in your parenthetical citation. So these divisions, act, scene, book, and so forth, are separated by a period with no spaces. So I'll give you an example. Here is a screenshot from Hamlet. We got act and scene numbers, act 1, scene 5, and then we've got the line numbers off to the left there. So when quoting this, we're going to have to include all of that information in the parenthetical citations. You might pause and read this example. Got act 1, scene 5, lines 10 through 13 that I quoted. But note that in my second quote, because I'm still quoting from the same act and the same scene, I do not need to repeat act 1, scene 5. I can just say 16, and the reader will know that that's line 16 from act 1 and scene 5. But if I start quoting different acts and different scenes, every time I switch, I've got to make sure that my reader understands where I'm moving around in the text. Got to keep the reader oriented. Quoting prose. When you quote prose, however, you cite the page number first. Always the page number, and most of the time I would say only the page number. But if necessary, the sections into which the work is divided, if the prose is divided by act, scene, or more commonly book or chapter, then you could include those sections if you feel it's going to help your reader. So for example, you could cite Mary Shelley's Frankenstein by page number alone, but it might be important for the sake of clarity to include a volume or chapter number as well as the page number, in which case you would need to identify the relevant divisions in your citation. So what would that look like? So here's a screenshot of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, volume 1, and the beginning of the book is a series of letters, of course. So this is what my parenthetical citation would look like. It would say Shelley 5. That means Shelley, page 5. And that could be the whole parenthetical citation. But if for some reason I want the reader to know that I'm in volume 1, letter 1, then that comes after a semicolon. So Shelley 5, semicolon, volume 1, comma, letter 1. So here's another example, also from Frankenstein. Shelley 69, volume 2, chapter 1. Page 69, semicolon, volume 2, comma, chapter 1. If it was just, say, a chapter number, it would be Shelley 69, comma, chapter 1, no semicolon. here's the preface to Frankenstein. And this is a little more complicated. The preface to Frankenstein was not written by Mary Shelley. It was written by her husband. So like other forms of front matter, the preface is paginated using Roman numerals rather than the customary Arabic numerals. And let's say, just for this example, that because we're writing about Frankenstein, we also wind up citing a number of other works by both Mary and Percy Shelley in the same document, the same essay. Given all of these complications, what should the parenthetical citation look like? And here it is. This is the most complicated parenthetical citation I've ever created. So we're going to identify Shelley, but because there are two Shelleys here, I abbreviate his first name, just use the first initial so that we know we're talking about Percy and not Mary Shelley. And then we're talking about the preface, which I'm abbreviating. And if I'm citing multiple things by Percy Shelley, I've got to say, well, which text of Percy Shelley am I citing in this essay? Well, I'm citing the preface. The preface to what? The preface to Frankenstein, which I put in square brackets. And then because it's in Roman numerals, it's paginated using Roman numerals, I stick with that. That's the method that's used in the book. So these are sort of extreme examples, but they are things that come up from time to time. Here are some of the common abbreviations that you might use. So scene, SC period, book, BK period, volume, VOL period, chapter, CH period, and paragraph, PAR period. Act and line or lines are never abbreviated. And remember, the word page is not included in parenthetical citations, so there is no need ever to use the abbreviations PG period or PP period. Quoting dialogue. So although uncommon, it is sometimes necessary to quote dialogue spoken between two or more characters, and quoted dialogue is always attached as a hanging quote. To quote dialogue in a play, characters' names should appear in all capital letters followed by a period. And you use a hanging indent if the speech runs longer than one line. So, taking a look at this example, you'll see that the whole dialogue between King Claudius and Hamlet is a hanging indent because it goes for well over 4 lines, obviously. But notice that with Hamlet's speech, the second time he speaks here, his dialogue goes longer than just the one line, so there is an extra hanging indent to show that. So all capital letters, period, and then the dialogue, and then an extra hanging indent if one of the characters' lines is more than 1 line long. To quote dialogue in prose fiction, after creating the half-inch hanging indent for the block, you indent an additional half-inch for the first speaker and an additional half-inch for every new speaker thereafter. So I indented for the hanging quote, and then I indented again for the first line of the speaker, and then notice that the second line of that speaker is just the regular hanging indent. But then I've got a new speaker on line 3 there, so again I've got the double hanging indent. It might be helpful just to kind of pause and think this through. This comes from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Quoting online texts. This is something that I generally will discourage. Web pages and ebooks. Using online texts involves extra work for you and some risk of inaccuracy because these texts are often corrupt, incorrect, inconsistent between devices, or incomplete. Usually they have not been edited by a scholar and they have no scholarly apparatus to orient you to it. So as an English major, you should consult reputable, up-to-date scholarly editions whenever possible and try to avoid using web pages and ebooks as primary sources. One difficulty with online texts is that they often appear without proper lineation or pagination. So this means that you will need to count lines yourself if you are citing verse, and when citing literary works in prose, you will need to count paragraphs and include the paragraph number in your citation. It's a primary source, so you got to be able to orient your reader. So here is Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. There are no line numbers listed there, so they would have to be counted. And again, the same problem here with William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. There are no page breaks, so you're going to be counting paragraphs. So instead of citing a page number, we're going to have to cite sections and paragraph numbers. A Rose for Emily is divided into sections. You can see that here. You can see section 1, and then towards the bottom of the screenshot, you can see section 2 begins. So how many paragraphs are in section 1? 1, 2, 6, 7, 8, 9. I already lost count. See, it's kind of a pain. So easier just to use a print version that's been edited by a scholar. If I had to use this, this is what my parenthetical citation would look like. Faulkner, chapter 1, comma, paragraph 6. So that covers a lot of the intricacies of parenthetical citations when citing literary texts. We're going to finish off by talking about the literary present tense. In general, unless it is important for the reader to know exactly when something happened, that it happened in the past or before something else in a story or poem, you want to use present tense verbs to attach quoted material. So here I use the past tense. This is what Anderson did in the past. But when I'm talking about what he has written in the story, I use the present tense. Anderson describes, not Anderson described. That is called the literary present tense. It is helpful to try to follow the same practice when describing what happens in a story, what the characters say or do, even when the story is narrated in the past tense. So notice here I say Anderson describes the ease Wing Biddlebaum feels whenever he spends time with George Willard. Notice that's all in the present tense. But in the book, the story is actually told in the past tense. And you can see that with the past tense verbs in my quote. Another way to deal with literary material in the past tense is to use integration to convert it to the present tense. So here is a long quote. I think I've used this quote earlier, where the verbs are highlighted in yellow. They're in the past tense. And this is fine. There's nothing particularly wrong with this. But integration offers another solution that eliminates the past tense verbs completely. So highlighted in blue here are the words and phrases I want to integrate. And this allows me to work around those past tense verbs and use new verbs in the present tense. And then you can see my new verbs there highlighted in yellow with my integrated quotes. You'll observe that in this example, I replaced Anderson's verbs with similar words in the present tense. And that concludes this 3-part series on writing about literature.